The ice cubes hit the mahogany partition with a deafening crack, scattering across the first-class cabin like diamonds on a showroom floor. Sticky, amber liquid dripped down the face of the man in seat 1A, a man who hadn't said a word to deserve it. The entire cabin gasped, the silence stretching so tight it felt like the fuselage might snap. Preston Gallagher, face flushed with bourbon and rage, loomed over the older black man, his finger shaking. "You people," Preston sneered, his voice dripping with entitlement, "think affirmative action buys you a seat at the head of the table. You're the help. Act like it." The older man didn't flinch. He slowly wiped the whiskey from his cheek with a linen napkin, folded it neatly, and looked up with eyes that held the weight of a collapsing star. "Mr. Gallagher," the man said, his voice terrifyingly calm, "I don't just have a seat at the table. I own the table. And as of 10 seconds ago, I own the plane you're standing on." The humidity inside JFK Terminal 4 was stifling. Or perhaps it was just the noose of debt tightening around Preston Gallagher's neck. Preston checked his reflection in the tinted glass of the departure lounge. At 42, he was the picture of American corporate aggression. He wore a navy-bespoke Brioni suit, cut sharp to hide the 5 pounds of stress weight he'd gained in the last month. On his wrist sat a Patek Philippe Nautilus, a $60,000 watch that he had technically leveraged against his house in the Hamptons 3 days ago. "I don't care what the board says, Beatrice," Preston hissed into his iPhone, pacing a tight circle near the first-class check-in counters. "If I don't land this merger in London by tomorrow morning, Gallagher Dynamics is insolvent. We are talking Chapter 11. We are talking my face on the cover of the Journal for all the wrong reasons. Fix the paperwork. I'm boarding." He hung up, his thumb mashing the red icon with unnecessary force. He ran a hand through his slicked-back blonde hair. He needed a drink. He needed a win. But mostly, he needed everyone to get out of his way. The line for the Meridian Airways first-class check-in was short, occupied by only one other person. Preston frowned. Standing at the counter was a man who looked like he had wandered in from the wrong entrance. He was an older black gentleman, perhaps in his late 60s, with salt and pepper hair cut close to his scalp. He wore a simple, beige cardigan over a white t-shirt, loose-fitting linen trousers, and worn leather loafers. He held a weathered leather duffel bag that looked like it had survived a war zone. Preston scoffed audibly. The man was taking too long. He was chatting with the gate agent, a young woman named Sarah, who was smiling a little too brightly. Preston stepped up, invading the man's personal space. "Excuse me," Preston said, his voice projecting that specific frequency of irritation reserved for CEOs and toddlers. The older man turned. He had a kind face, etched with deep laugh lines, but his eyes were sharp, intelligent. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice a deep, rolling baritone. "The economy drop-off is roughly 300 yards that way," Preston said, pointing a manicured finger toward the chaotic main terminal. "This is the priority lane. First class and global services only. You're holding up the line." The older man blinked, his expression unreadable. "I am aware of where I am standing, young man. I'm just clarifying a seating arrangement with Sarah here." "Well, clarify it somewhere else," Preston snapped, checking his watch. "Some of us have businesses to run. We don't all have the luxury of chatting about the weather while clutching, whatever that is." He gestured vaguely at the man's battered bag. "Janitorial shift doesn't start until the plane lands." Sarah, the agent, went pale. "Mr. Gallagher," she interrupted, her voice trembling slightly. "Mr. Banks is a valued—" "It's fine, Sarah," the man. "Mr. Banks," said gently, raising a hand. He looked at Preston, not with anger, but with a pitiable sort of amusement. "Patience is a virtue, even for the captains of industry, perhaps especially for them. I don't need fortune cookie wisdom from a man wearing a sweater he bought at a garage sale, Preston retorted, stepping around him to slam his platinum passport onto the counter. Check me in. Now, and make sure I'm nowhere near him. I can't stand the smell of mothballs. Mr. Banks picked up his bag. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He simply nodded to Sarah. I'll see you on board, Sarah. Thank you for your help. As Banks walked away toward security, Preston watched him go, shaking his head. Unbelievable, Preston muttered as Sarah typed furiously, avoiding his gaze. You let anyone in here these days. Dilutes the brand value. You tell corporate that Preston Gallagher said standards are slipping. I'll be sure to make a note of it, sir, Sarah said, her jaw tight. She handed him his boarding pass. Seat 1A, have a pleasant flight. I doubt it. Preston snatched the ticket. I'm surrounded by amateurs. He stormed toward the TSA pre-check lane, unaware that the amateur he had just insulted was currently texting the CEO of the holding company Preston was flying to London to beg for money. The Meridian Airways Airbus A380 was a flying palace. The upper-class cabin was designed to look less like an airplane and more like a Manhattan penthouse. Soft, ambient lighting shifted from sunset orange to a calming violet. The air smelled of white tea and bergamot. Preston loved it. This was his natural habitat. This was where he belonged. He stowed his Toomey carry-on in the overhead bin and settled into seat 1A. He immediately reclined the leather seat, kicking his feet out. He snapped his fingers at a passing flight attendant. Champagne, Krug, vintage if you have it, and don't bring me the warm stuff from the bottom of the cart. Right away, Mr. Gallagher, the attendant said, forcing a smile. Preston pulled out his laptop. He had 6 hours to memorize the financials for Omicron Capital. He needed to convince the board at Omicron that Gallagher Dynamics was a thriving innovator, not a sinking ship laden with lawsuits and failed prototypes. He heard a shuffling noise in the aisle. Oh, excuse me. Pardon me. Preston froze. He knew that deep voice. He looked up. Standing in the aisle, trying to maneuver his battered leather duffel into the bin above seat 1B, directly across the aisle from Preston, was Mr. Banks. Preston's jaw dropped. You have got to be kidding me. Banks settled into the seat, adjusting his beige cardigan. He looked over at Preston and offered a polite nod. Hello again. It seems we are neighbors. Preston slammed his laptop shut. Stewardess, he shouted, his voice cracking. A senior flight attendant, a woman with a stern face and impeccable posture named Helen, appeared instantly. Is there a problem, Mr. Gallagher? Yes, there is a massive problem, Preston hissed, gesturing wildly at Banks, who had already opened a thick, hardcover book and was putting on reading glasses. There has been a mistake, a clerical error. Sir? Him, Preston pointed. He's in the wrong seat. This is first class. Look at him. He's obviously confused. He probably saw an empty seat and sat down. Check his ticket. Banks didn't look up from his book. He turned a page with a dry rustle. Helen looked from Preston to Banks, then back to Preston. Her expression cooled significantly. Mr. Banks is in his assigned seat, sir. Seat 1B. That is impossible, Preston laughed, a cruel, barking sound. Do you know how much this ticket costs? That's $12,000. Does he look like he has $12,000? He looks like he drives the shuttle bus to the parking lot. The cabin had gone quiet. A few other passengers, a tech mogul in 2A and a socialite in 2B, were watching over the tops of their noise-cancelling headphones. Banks slowly lowered his book. It was The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, an original edition by the look of the binding. Mr. Gallagher, Banks said softly, I assure you, my ticket is paid for. I prefer to travel comfortably, just as you do. Now, if you don't mind, I am at a very interesting chapter." "I do mind." Preston stood up, towering over the seated man. The alcohol he'd consumed in the lounge was beginning to mix with his adrenaline. "I mind that I pay a premium for exclusivity, for a certain caliber of environment, and having to stare at someone who looks like he should be sweeping the hangar ruins the experience." He turned to Helen. "Move him, or move me. I am a Platinum Medallion member. I spend $500,000 a year with this airline. If you don't fix this, I will make one phone call and have your badge on my desk by Monday morning." Helen took a deep breath. "Mr. Gallagher, the flight is fully booked. Everyone is in their assigned seats. I must ask you to sit down and fasten your seatbelt. We are pushing back from the gate." "This is unacceptable," Preston spat. "Absolutely ghetto behavior from this airline." He slumped back into his seat, glaring at Banks. Banks simply adjusted his glasses, picked up his glass of water, and continued reading. "Enjoy your water, Grandpa," Preston muttered loud enough to be heard. "Probably the cleanliest thing you've touched all day." Banks paused. A shadow passed over his face, a flicker of something ancient and dangerous, like a sleeping dragon disturbed by a gnat. But it vanished as quickly as it came. "We shall see, Mr. Gallagher," Banks whispered to the empty air. "We shall see." The plane lurched backward. The safety video began to play. Preston pulled out his phone to send one last text to his assistant. Text to Beatrice. "You won't believe the creature I'm sitting next to. Airline has gone to the dogs. Fix the presentation. I need to crush Omicron." As the plane taxied to the runway, the engines roared to life. Preston felt the familiar pull of gravity. He closed his eyes, visualizing his victory in London. He didn't see Banks watching him, a look of profound sorrow and calculation in his eyes. He didn't know that the man in the beige cardigan wasn't reading about economics anymore. He was watching the trajectory of a man about to fly straight into the sun. 3 hours into the flight, the atmosphere in the upper-class cabin had shifted from tense to toxic. While the aircraft cruised smoothly over the Atlantic at 38,000 feet, Preston Gallagher was undergoing a personal nosedive. He was on his 4th double scotch. His tie was loosened, hanging like a limp noose around his neck, and his laptop screen was glowing with a spreadsheet that was bleeding red ink. The Wi-Fi on board was fast enough for Preston to receive a devastating email from his CFO, Beatrice. Subject: urgent. Omicron pulling back. Body: Preston, bad news. Their due diligence team found the undisclosed liabilities in the Nevada project. They're getting cold feet. Unless you can dazzle them in London personally, the deal is dead. You need a miracle. Preston stared at the screen, his vision blurring slightly. "Dead," he whispered. "They can't be dead." If the deal died, he lost everything. The Hamptons house, the Tribeca loft, the Aston Martin, the illusion of success he had carefully curated for 2 decades. He looked up, needing a target for his rage. His eyes landed on seat 1B. Mr. Banks was currently enjoying the meal service. He had declined the lobster thermidor and the caviar. Instead, he was eating a simple roasted chicken breast with garden vegetables, chewing slowly and methodically. He had put his book away and was sketching in a small, leather-bound notebook with a charcoal pencil. The serenity of the man infuriated Preston. How could someone with so little in Preston's mind be so at peace, while he, a titan of industry, was crumbling? "Hey!" Preston barked across the aisle. Banks didn't hear him, or chose not to. He continued sketching. "Hey!" Preston said louder, snapping his fingers. "Picasso, I'm talking to you." Banks paused, his hand hovering over the paper. He turned his head slowly. "Were you addressing me, Mr. Gallagher?" I don't see anyone else around here wearing a sweater that smells like a retirement home. Preston slurred slightly. What are you drawing? Let me guess. A winning lottery ticket? Because that's the only way you're sitting in that seat. Banks closed the notebook gently. I am sketching the wing structure, actually. The A380 has a fascinating lift-to-drag ratio. It's a marvel of engineering. Preston laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. Engineering? You wouldn't know engineering if it bit you. Stick to what you know. Which is probably, what? Mowing lawns? Fixing sinks? My father fixed sinks, Banks said, his voice level but hardening like drying concrete. He was a plumber, an honest trade. He taught me that a pipe is only as strong as its weakest joint, a lesson that applies to businesses too, Mr. Gallagher. And men. Preston's face flushed a deep crimson. Are you lecturing me? You? I run a multinational conglomerate. I move millions of dollars with a keystroke. I am the economy. You are clutter. And yet, Banks said, picking up his glass of iced tea, we are both heading to the same destination, at the same speed. Gravity does not care about your bank account, son. Don't call me son, Preston hissed. I am not your son. I am your better. Helen, the flight attendant, appeared with a fresh bottle of water. She looked concerned. She had been listening from the galley. Mr. Gallagher, can I get you anything else? Perhaps some coffee? We have a lovely Blue Mountain blend. I don't want coffee, Preston shouted, causing the passenger in 2A to jump. I want some peace and quiet. I want this affirmative action higher to stop looking at me. Sir, Mr. Banks hasn't said a word to you until you engaged him, Helen said, her tone professional, but icy. Please lower your voice. There are families on board. I paid for this air! Preston gestured wildly, knocking his empty Scotch glass against the armrest. I paid for the space. I didn't pay to sit next to... He trailed off, muttering a slur under his breath that was audible enough to freeze the blood of anyone listening. Banks didn't react with anger. He reacted with a profound stillness. He looked at Preston with an expression that was almost clinical, like a scientist observing a rabid lab rat. Mr. Gallagher, Banks said quietly, you are under a great deal of stress. I can see that. The smell of fear is stronger than the scotch on your breath. But I suggest you be very careful about your next few words. You are writing checks your character cannot cash. Fear? Preston unbuckled his seatbelt. He stood up, swaying slightly in the narrow aisle. The cabin lights were dimmed for the night portion of the flight, casting long, eerie shadows. You think I'm afraid? I'm Preston Gallagher. I eat fear for breakfast. What I am is disgusted. He stepped closer to Banks. The difference in their posture was striking. Preston was rigid, vibrating with nervous energy. Banks was relaxed, grounded, an immovable object. You're sitting there judging me, Preston spat, with your cheap notebook and your smug face. You think you're equal to me because you bought a ticket? You'll never be equal. You're the help. That's all you people ever are. The entire first-class cabin was awake now. The tech mogul in 2A had taken off his headphones. The socialite in 2B was filming on her phone, the lens peeking through the gap in the seats. Helen stepped between them, her hand raised. Mr. Gallagher, sit down immediately. This is your final warning before I alert the captain. Alert the captain! Preston roared. Tell him to come back here. I want this man moved to the cargo hold where he belongs. Preston reached for his refill, a fresh glass of bourbon that Helen had mistakenly left on the center console during the argument. He grabbed the heavy crystal tumbler. The ice clinked. He looked at the drink. He looked at Banks's pristine beige cardigan. The logic in Preston's brain had short-circuited. in his drunken, panicked mind. Banks was the physical embodiment of all the obstacles in his life. Banks was the board members denying him funds. Banks was the failing engine parts. Banks was the reason he was losing. "You want a drink?" Preston sneered. "Have one on me." The motion was jagged and violent. Preston swung his arm forward. The amber liquid arched through the air, catching the cabin light like molten gold before splashing heavily across Mr. Banks's chest and face. The ice cubes hit the mahogany partition with a deafening crack, scattering across the first-class cabin like diamonds on a showroom floor. Sticky, aromatic bourbon dripped down the face of the man in seat 1B, a man who hadn't said a word to deserve it. The entire cabin gasped. The silence that followed stretched so tight it felt like the fuselage might snap. Helen let out a sharp cry, her hands flying to her mouth. "Oh my God!" Preston stood there, his chest heaving, the empty glass still clutched in his hand. For a second, he felt a surge of triumph, a release of the pressure that had been building for weeks. He had asserted dominance. He had put the world back in its proper order. "There," Preston panted, wiping a stray drop of liquor from his own hand. "Now you look like a drunk. Maybe they'll kick you off." Mr. Banks did not jump. He did not shout. He did not raise his fists. He simply closed his eyes for a brief second, exhaled a long, steady breath, and reached for the linen napkin on his tray table. Slowly, with agonizing precision, he wiped the whiskey from his eyes. He dabbed at his cheek. He unfolded the napkin and laid it over the worst of the stain on his cardigan. Then he looked up. His eyes, previously warm and intelligent, were now cold. Not the cold of ice, but the cold of deep space. An infinite, crushing void. "Mr. Gallagher," the man said, his voice terrifyingly calm. It resonated through the silent cabin, carrying more weight than Preston's shouting ever could. Banks unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. He was taller than he looked while seated. He stood 6'2", his shoulders broad, his posture commanding. He loomed over Preston, not with physical threat, but with moral authority. "You seem to be laboring under a series of catastrophic misconceptions," Banks said. "You believe that money makes you a king. You believe that loud noises make you right. And most tragically, you believe that I am powerless." "Sit down," Preston stammered, his bravado wavering in the face of Banks's composure. You're a mess. Look at you." "I am wet," Banks corrected him. "You, however, are finished." Banks turned to Helen. She was shaking, tears in her eyes. "Helen," he said gently, "would you please ask Captain Reynolds to step out of the cockpit for a moment? I believe we have a security issue." "Who do you think you are?" Preston laughed nervously, looking around for support from the other passengers, but finding only disgusted glares. "You can't just summon the captain. He's flying the plane." "Helen," Banks repeated, ignoring Preston. "Please." Yes, sir," Helen stammered. She picked up the interphone and punched in a code. "Captain, we have a code red in first class. Passenger interference. Mr. Banks is asking for you." Preston froze. "Mr. Banks is asking for you. Not a passenger is asking. Not we have a problem." A moment later, the cockpit door hissed open. Captain Reynolds, a silver-haired veteran pilot with 4 stripes on his shoulders, stepped out. He looked stern, his eyes scanning the scene instantly. He saw the spilled bourbon. He saw the ice on the floor. He saw Preston swaying, and then he saw Banks. The captain's face changed instantly. The stern authority melted into deep, respectful recognition. He straightened his uniform and stepped forward quickly. "Mr. Banks," Captain Reynolds said, his voice full of concern. "Are you all right, sir? I heard a disturbance." Preston's brain tried to process the scene. The captain wasn't looking at him. He was looking at the old man in the stained cardigan, with the deference a soldier shows a general. "I'm fine, David," Banks said to the captain, using his first name. "Just a little spill. However, Mr. Gallagher here seems to be having a difficult flight. He is under the impression that this airline belongs to him because he purchased a ticket." Banks turned back to Preston. The cabin was deadly silent. "Mr. Gallagher," Banks said, his voice dropping an octave, "you told me earlier that I am the help. You said I own a seat at the table because of affirmative action." Banks took a step closer, invading Preston's space for the first time. "My name is Archibald Banks. I am the founder and majority shareholder of the Meridian Group." Preston blinked. The name bounced around his alcohol-soaked brain. Meridian Group, the parent company of Meridian Airways, the company that owned the hotels, the logistics chains, the planes. "I don't just have a seat at the table," Banks continued, his voice ringing with power. "I built the table. I own the wood the table is made of. And as of 10 seconds ago, I own the plane you're standing on, the seat you're sitting in, and the uniform of the pilot you are hoping will save you." Preston's face went white. The blood drained from his extremities so fast he felt dizzy. "No," Preston whispered. "No, you're the janitor?" Banks raised an eyebrow. "I started as a mechanic. Yes, 40 years ago. Now? Now I am the man who decides who flies on my aircraft." Banks turned to the captain. "David, are we near a diversion point?" Captain Reynolds nodded sharply. "We are passing just south of Gander, Newfoundland, sir. We can be on the ground in 40 minutes. "Good," Banks said, brushing a piece of ice off his shoulder. "Dump the fuel. Put us down." You can't do that," Preston squeaked. "I have a meeting in London. I have to be there. You can't land the plane." Banks looked at Preston with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Gallagher, I own the airline. I can land this plane on the moon if I feel like it. And right now, I feel like getting this stain out of my shirt and getting you off my property." "This is kidnapping," Preston shouted, panic setting in. I'll sue you for everything." "You can try," Banks said calmly, sitting back down in his wet seat and picking up his book. "But I suspect you'll be too busy dealing with the federal authorities when we land, assaulting a passenger, interfering with a flight crew. That's a federal felony, son." Banks opened his book to the marked page. "Now sit down and be quiet. The adults are talking." Preston Gallagher collapsed into his seat, not because he wanted to, but because his legs finally gave out. He stared at the back of the seat in front of him, the realization crashing down on him harder than the whiskey bottle ever could. He had just thrown a drink at the owner of the sky, and the descent had just begun. The announcement from the flight deck was not the usual, polished, reassuring murmur of a commercial pilot. It was sharp, clipped, and laced with a suppressed fury that vibrated through the PA system. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds. We have a security situation in the forward cabin involving a passenger interfering with a flight crew member and the safety of the aircraft. As per federal aviation regulations and the direct order of the airline ownership, we are diverting immediately to Gander International Airport in Newfoundland, Canada. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for immediate arrival. We will be dumping fuel to reach maximum landing weight. I apologize to the rest of you for the inconvenience, but zero tolerance means zero tolerance." The click of the intercom cutting off sounded like a gavel striking a judge's bench. Preston Gallagher sat paralyzed in seat 1A. The alcohol in his system, which moments ago had made him feel like a god, had now turned into a sour, churning acid in his gut. The reality of his situation wasn't sinking in all at once. It was hitting him in waves, each one colder and more suffocating than the last. He looked out the reinforced window. From the trailing edge of the massive A380 wing, a white mist was spraying out into the night sky. Fuel! Thousands of gallons of Jet A1 fuel, worth tens of thousands of dollars, were being jettisoned into the atmosphere simply to get him off this plane. They're actually doing it, Preston thought, his hands trembling uncontrollably. He's burning money just to get rid of me. He turned his head slowly toward seat 1B. Archibald Banks had not moved. He was calmly using a second napkin to dry the cover of his book. The wet cardigan had been removed, revealed a crisp white undershirt that looked far more expensive than Preston's entire suit. Banks folded the ruined beige sweater with the care one might give a flag. "Mr. Banks," Preston whispered. His voice was a rasp, stripped of all its earlier bravado. Banks didn't look up. He continued smoothing the fabric. "Mr. Banks, please." Preston tried again, louder this time. "We need to talk about this. I think emotions ran high. I've been under a lot of pressure. The merger, the stress." Banks finally turned. His face was devoid of anger, which was infinitely worse. It was the face of a man looking at a column of numbers that didn't add up, a problem to be deleted. "Stress." Banks repeated the word as if tasting it. "You think you know stress, son? Stress is wondering if the radiator in your apartment will work when it's 10 degrees below zero and you have a newborn baby in the crib. Stress is working a double shift at the hangar, scrubbing grease off landing gear until your fingers bleed just to buy textbooks. Stress is not worrying about whether your golden parachute is big enough." "I can pay," Preston blurted out. It was his reflex. It was how he solved everything. "The fuel, the landing fees. I'll write a check right now. I'll cover the diversion costs. Just tell the pilot to pull up. Turn us back to London. I cannot miss this meeting." Banks laughed softly, a dry, dusty sound. "You still don't understand the currency we are trading in, do you? You think this is about money? Mr. Gallagher, I have lost more money in the cushions of my sofa than you will earn in your lifetime. This isn't about the cost of the fuel. It is about the cost of dignity." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the cabin noise. "You assaulted me. That I can forgive. I have thick skin. But you disrespected my crew. You made Helen cry. You terrified the young lady at the gate. You treated human beings like furniture. And you did it on my bird. This airline is my family. You came into my house and kicked the dog. You don't buy your way out of that." "I'll lose everything," Preston said, his voice cracking. Tears of pure, selfish panic pricked his eyes. "If I don't land in London, my company goes under. I'll be bankrupt." "Then perhaps," Banks said, picking up his book again, "you should have thought about that before you threw a glass of bourbon at a stranger." The plane banked sharply to the left. The smooth hum of the cruise was replaced by the mechanical whine of the flaps extending. Gravity pressed them into their seats. Behind them, the cabin was abuzz. The tech mogul in 2A, a man named Roger Sterling, no relation to the fictional character, but with similar swagger, leaned forward. "Hey, Gallagher," he shouted. "Thanks a lot, buddy. I'm missing a keynote speech in Munich because you couldn't handle your liquor. I hope they throw the book at you." The socialite in 2B, a young woman named Veronica, who had millions of followers on TikTok, was holding her phone up. The red recording light was steady. "Say hi to the internet," Veronica said, her voice dripping with disdain. "I've been live streaming for 10 minutes. You're trending. Walter de first-class freakout. Twitter is already doxing your company." Preston recoiled as if slapped. He fumbled for his own phone. He had to stop this. He had to call Beatrice. He had to spin the narrative. He unlocked his screen. No signal. They were too low for satellite, too high for cell towers. He was cut off. Helen walked by, her face composed but her eyes red. She carried a plastic flex cuff restraint in her hand, though she kept it discreetly behind her back. She stopped at Banks's seat. "Mr. Banks, Captain says we are 10 minutes from touchdown. Ground control in Gander has the RCMP standing by at the gate." "Thank you, Helen," Banks said warmly. "I'm sorry for the detour. I'll make sure the crew is compensated for the overtime, and I'll arrange for a hotel for everyone in Gander until we can refuel and get a fresh slot." "You're too kind, sir," Helen said. Then she looked at Preston. Her face hardened into granite. "Mr. Gallagher, seat back up. Tray table stowed. Now." Preston obeyed mechanically. He felt like a child being scolded, stripped of all agency. The descent into Gander was rough. The winds off the North Atlantic were howling, buffeting the massive A380. The plane shook and rattled, the overhead bins groaning. To Preston, every bump felt like the universe punching him. He looked out the window again. Below there was nothing but the pitch-black void of the ocean, and then, suddenly, the stark, lonely lights of Newfoundland. It looked cold. It looked isolated. It looked like the end of the world. "This can't be real," Preston thought. "This is a nightmare. I'm going to wake up in my loft in Tribeca." But the thud screech of the tires hitting the tarmac was deafeningly real. The reverse thrusters roared like angry dragons, slowing the massive beast of a plane. Preston Gallagher, the man who moved markets, the man who owned the room, was now just cargo. Dangerous, unwanted cargo being delivered to the authorities. As the plane slowed to a taxi, the captain's voice returned. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Gander. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We are going to be holding here on the apron while local law enforcement boards the aircraft. Once they have removed the security concern, we will proceed to the gate for refueling. Thank you for your patience." The plane came to a halt. The engines whined down. The silence that filled the cabin was heavy, broken only by the sound of Preston's ragged breathing. He looked at Banks one last time. Banks was looking out the window, watching the flashing blue and red lights of the police cruisers racing across the tarmac toward the plane. "Mr. Banks," Preston said, a final, desperate plea. "I have a family." Banks didn't look back. "So do I, Mr. Gallagher, and I intend to get home to them. Goodbye." The sound of the forward cabin door being unlatched echoed through the fuselage. The cold Canadian air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and jet fuel. Preston closed his eyes. The show was over. The wait was the worst part. It took 5 minutes for the stairs to be aligned. 5 minutes where Preston had to sit there, feeling the eyes of every person in the cabin boring into the back of his neck. He could hear whispers from economy class behind the curtain. The news had spread. Everyone knew why they were in Newfoundland. "That's the guy. The one in the suit. Threw a drink at the owner? Is he insane?" Preston stared at his hands. They looked foreign to him. These were hands that signed million-dollar contracts. Now, they were shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. 2 figures appeared at the cabin door. They wore the dark navy uniforms of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, their yellow stripes stark under the cabin lights. They were big men, wearing heavy parkas and serious expressions. They weren't smiling. Helen pointed directly at seat 1A. "That's him, Mr. Gallagher." The officers marched down the aisle. Their boots were heavy on the carpet. "Preston Gallagher?" the first officer asked. His name tag read, Constable Miller. Preston didn't stand up. He couldn't. His legs felt like jelly. "Yes," he croaked. "I am placing you under arrest for disturbance of the peace, assault, and interference with a flight crew under the Canadian Aeronautics Act," Miller recited, his voice bored but firm. You are to come with us immediately." "You don't understand." Preston tried to engage his lawyer brain, but the words came out as mush. "This is a misunderstanding. It was a dispute between passengers. Civil, not criminal. I'm an American citizen. I demand to speak to the U.S. consulate." "You can speak to whoever you want once you're in a cell, sir," the second officer, Sergeant Tremblay, said. He reached down, grabbed Preston by the bicep, and hauled him out of the seat with humiliating ease. "Up, now!" Preston stumbled into the aisle. He tried to straighten his suit jacket, a pathetic attempt to retain some dignity. "Turn around," Tremblay ordered. "You're not handcuffing me," Preston gasped. "I'm not a criminal. I'm a CEO." "Turn around," Tremblay repeated, louder. He spun Preston around and slapped the steel cuffs onto his wrists. The sound of the ratcheting metal was the loudest thing in the world. It signaled the death of Preston Gallagher, the entity. As they began to march him toward the door, Preston looked desperately at the other passengers. He looked at the tech mogul, Roger. "Roger, you know me. We met at Davos. Tell them who I am." Roger looked at his fingernails. "I've never seen you before in my life, pal." Preston looked at Veronica, the socialite. She was holding her phone right in his face. "Smile for the camera, Karen," she sneered. And then he looked at Archibald Banks. Banks was standing now, speaking quietly with the captain near the cockpit door. As Preston was dragged past, Banks paused. Preston stopped, digging his heels into the carpet, forcing the cops to halt for a second. "You ruined me," Preston spat at the old man. "Over a spilled drink. You vindictive old—" Banks looked at him with genuine pity. "I didn't ruin you, son. You've been ruining yourself for years. I just held up a mirror. I hope you find some peace on the ground. You certainly won't find it in the air ever again." "What does that mean?" Preston demanded. "It means," Banks said, his voice hard as steel, "that you are banned, not just from Meridian Airways, but through the Alliance, Delta, Virgin, Air France. I'm making the calls tonight. You are on the no-fly list for the entire SkyTeam Alliance and our partners. You're going to have to take a boat to get home. Mr. Gallagher." The blood drained from Preston's face. In his world, travel was oxygen. Being banned from the major airlines was a professional death sentence. "Get him off my plane," Banks said to the officers. The officers shoved Preston forward. He stumbled through the door and out onto the metal stairs. The wind hit him like a physical blow. It was freezing, a bitter, biting cold that cut right through his expensive Italian wool suit. He shivered violently. Below, on the tarmac, a police cruiser waited with its lights flashing. A baggage cart driver stopped to watch. A mechanic looked up. They were all watching the man in the fancy suit being walked down the stairs in cuffs. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, the Wi-Fi on his phone reconnected to a roaming network. His pocket buzzed. Then it buzzed again. Then it began to vibrate continuously, a swarm of angry bees against his thigh. One of the officers opened the back door of the cruiser. "Watch your head." "Wait," Preston pleaded. "My phone, it's ringing. It might be my lawyer." The officer sighed. "I'll check it. If it's a lawyer, I'll answer." Constable Miller pulled the phone out of Preston's pocket. He looked at the screen. "It's not a lawyer," Miller said. "It's a text. From Beatrice." Preston's heart stopped. "Read it, please." Miller squinted at the screen, reading the notification aloud in the cold night air. "Preston, the video is everywhere. TMZ just picked it up. The Omicron board just called. The deal is off. They are pulling the term sheet. And the board of directors at Gallagher Dynamics is calling an emergency meeting for 8 a.m. to discuss your removal. Don't bother coming to London. It's over." Miller looked at Preston, then shoved the phone back into Preston's pocket. "Sounds like you've had a bad day, bud," the officer said dryly. He pushed Preston's head down and shoved him into the back of the police car. The door slammed shut, sealing Preston inside a cage of hard plastic and stale air. Through the wire mesh of the divider, Preston watched the massive A380 on the tarmac. He saw the fuel trucks approaching to top it off. He saw the warm, inviting glow of the windows. He saw the silhouette of Mr. Banks in window 1B, settling back into his seat, probably opening his book again. The police car engine revved. As they drove away toward the bleak, concrete terminal of the local precinct, Preston Gallagher slumped against the door. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He just stared into the darkness, watching his reflection in the glass, a reflection that looked smaller, older, and infinitely more pathetic than the man who had boarded the plane in New York. He had flown too close to the sun, but it wasn't the heat that killed him. It was the man in the beige cardigan. 6 months later, the world looked very different to Preston Gallagher. It looked a lot like the grey, cracked pavement of Queens, New York, seen through the scratched window of a crowded subway car. Preston adjusted his collar, but it wasn't the silk collar of a Brioni suit. It was the stiff, polyester collar of a charcoal work shirt. The name embroidered on the chest pocket didn't say CEO, it simply said P. Gallagher. His fall had been absolute. The video Veronica filmed on the plane had gone viral within hours. By the time he was released from Canadian custody 2 days later, after posting a bail amount that decimated his liquid savings, he was the most hated man in America. Gallagher Dynamics had fired him for gross moral turpitude before his feet even touched U.S. soil. The merger with Omicron collapsed, burying his reputation under the rubble. His wife, a woman who loved the lifestyle more than the man, had filed for divorce the following week, taking the house in the Hamptons and the dog. The Tribeca loft was foreclosed on. The Aston Martin was repossessed. Now Preston lived in a studio apartment in Astoria that smelled perpetually of boiled cabbage and damp drywall. He had applied to 50 executive jobs. He received 0 callbacks. He applied to mid-level management. 0 callbacks. He applied to consultancies. They laughed him off the phone. The name Preston Gallagher was radioactive. Today was his first day at the only place that would hire him, a logistics and shipping warehouse near JFK Airport. The job title was Ground Operations Associate. In plain English, he was a box mover. Preston stepped off the subway and walked the 6 blocks to the warehouse. The wind was cold, reminding him of that night in Gander. He pulled his thin jacket tighter. He didn't have money for a cab. He didn't have the status to demand one. He swiped his badge at the security gate. The beep was a harsh, judging sound. "You're late, Gallagher." The shift foreman, a burly man named Miller, ironically sharing the name of the constable who arrested him, grunted. "Dock 4. Truck just pulled in. Get unloading." "Yes, sir," Preston said quietly. He walked to the loading dock. 6 months ago, he would have fired Miller for looking at him the wrong way. Now, Miller held the keys to Preston's ability to eat dinner. For 4 hours, Preston hauled crates. His back screamed. His soft hands, once manicured, were now calloused and blistered. He sweated through his uniform. The physical labor was grueling, a penance that worked the arrogance out of his system, 1 drop of sweat at a time. Around noon, a hush fell over the warehouse floor. Usually, the warehouse was a cacophony of forklifts, shouting men and grinding gears. But the noise died down, rippling from the front entrance like a wave. Preston, wiping his forehead with a rag, looked up. He saw the other workers straightening their uniforms. He saw Miller, the foreman, take off his dirty cap and stand at attention. A small group of executives was walking down the center aisle. They were inspecting the facility. In the center of the group walked a man in a pristine navy suit. He walked with a cane now, a slight limp in his step, but his posture was upright, regal. He wasn't looking at the clipboards the managers were showing him. He was looking at the people. He was nodding to the forklift drivers, shaking hands with the packers. Preston froze. He felt the blood drain from his face. He tried to hide behind a stack of pallets, but his legs wouldn't move. It was Archibald Banks, of course. Meridian Logistics. This was a subsidiary of the Meridian Group. Preston hadn't even realized. He was working for the man he had assaulted. He held his breath, praying Banks would walk past, praying he was invisible. But Banks stopped. He stopped right in front of Dock 4. He said something to the facility manager, who pointed nervously at Preston. Banks tapped his cane on the concrete floor and walked slowly toward Preston. The warehouse was silent. Everyone was watching. Preston lowered his head. "Mr. Banks," he whispered, staring at the expensive leather shoes that were undoubtedly dry. "Mr. Gallagher," Banks said. His voice hadn't changed. It was still that deep, rolling baritone that commanded gravity. "I didn't know," Preston stammered, his voice trembling. "I didn't know you owned this warehouse. I'll leave. I'll pack my things. You don't have to fire me. I'll just go." Preston started to untuck his shirt to remove his badge. "Stop," Banks said. It wasn't a shout, but it halted Preston instantly. Banks stepped closer. He looked at Preston's dirty hands. He looked at the sweat stains on his collar. He looked at the exhaustion in his eyes. He didn't see the arrogant CEO anymore. He saw a broken man trying to survive. "I know you work here, Preston," Banks said softly. "I signed off on your hiring paperwork myself." Preston looked up, stunned. "What? Why? After what I did? Why would you let me in the building?" Banks smiled, a small, sad smile. "Do you remember what you told me on the plane? You said I looked like I should be fixing sinks. You said I was the help." Preston flinched. I was drunk. I was stupid. I am so sorry." "You were wrong," Banks corrected him. "But you were also right. I did fix sinks. My father was a plumber. I started my first business with a wrench in one hand and a mop in the other. I built this empire not from the boardroom down, but from the warehouse up." Banks gestured to the vast facility around them. "I hired you, Preston, because every man deserves to know what it feels like to build the table before he sits at it. You spent 40 years thinking you were better than the work. Now, you are doing the work." "It's hard," Preston admitted, tears welling in his eyes. "It's the hardest thing I've ever done." "Good," Banks nodded. "That burn in your muscles? That's honest pain. It's better than the ulcer of ambition you used to carry." Banks reached into his pocket. For a terrifying second, Preston thought he was pulling out a termination notice. Instead, Banks pulled out a pair of heavy-duty work gloves. He held them out to Preston. "I was told your quota is low on the loading dock," Banks said, his eyes twinkling with a hint of challenge. "You're slowing down the line. If you want to keep this job, you need to lift faster. We have a deadline for the London shipment." Preston stared at the gloves. It was a lifeline. It was a second chance. It wasn't a pardon. Banks wasn't saving him from the work. He was giving him the dignity of doing it. Preston took the gloves. His hands shook as he pulled them on. They fit perfectly. "Thank you, sir," Preston choked out. "I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Banks said. He turned to walk away, then paused. He looked back over his shoulder. "And Preston?" "Yes, Mr. Banks?" "The coffee machine in the break room breaks down every Tuesday. I hear you used to be good at managing complex systems. Maybe you can take a look at it. No extra pay, of course." Preston managed a weak, genuine smile. "I'll take a look at it, sir." "Good man." Archibald Banks walked away, tapping his cane against the concrete, the king of his domain. Preston stood there for a moment, watching him go. Then he turned back to the pallet of boxes. It was heavy. It was dirty. It was unglamorous. But for the first time in his life, as he lifted the box and placed it on the truck, Preston Gallagher didn't feel like a fraud. He felt the weight of the world, and he realized, finally, that he was strong enough to carry it. He got back to work. What a journey. Preston Gallagher learned the hard way that the higher you fly on the wings of arrogance, the harder the ground hits you when you fall. Mr. Banks didn't just teach him a lesson about who owned the plane. He taught him a lesson about who owns their soul. It's a powerful reminder to treat everyone with respect, whether they're the CEO or the janitor, because you never know who holds the keys to your future. If you enjoyed this story of instant karma and ultimate redemption, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. What did you think of Banks's decision to hire Preston at the end? Was it too kind, or was it the perfect punishment? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.